Joshua in my Old Testament class right now, and there was some neat things that just sparked my heart today. So I decided we can talk about some of those. They're relevant, so you'll see. And there's still kind of a tie to how Israel ends up in the state they are in Isaiah. So, all right, waiting to make sure we're online. Of course, all this is being broadcast, so hello, everybody. There we are. Captions are auto-generated. There we are. Okay, we are getting, looks like we're getting audio. We have video. We got a couple people jumping in online already. Oh, Cal, you're in the room, honey. Newsflash, you don't have to watch online.
I'm like, what? I'm like, what?
All right, so welcome everybody tonight. Welcome for those of you who are in the house and those of you who are joining with us online. Sorry, I was distracted for a minute. Reminder to everybody online, if you have any comments or input or anything like that, go ahead and type it right there in the comments section. I'll do my best to moderate that as we go through the conversation. Also, drop a hello, hi, how are you, something like that, so we can see that you're with us, and we can say a hello in response, okay? So tonight, as I was telling those of us who are here in the room, I just felt led to take a break from Isaiah tonight, just for a week. We're not stopping the process through Isaiah, but just for tonight, I felt like focusing in on a couple aspects of the book of Joshua that I think are really important to where we sit today, especially for those of us who have been believers for any length of time. We're going to see some things unpacked here in Joshua, some challenges. We're going to see some ideas. We're going to see some things that we're just going to talk about. So it's a little less step-by-step through like we've been doing with Isaiah, where we read through the text and we unpack it. It's a little more conversational and topical in nature. So just be ready to engage, to talk, okay? We're going to cover some neat things, all right? Hi, Elsa and Ted. Great to see you guys. Thanks for jumping in with us. So let me give you just a little bit of a rundown here, okay? A little bit of a background. Here at the beginning of Joshua, we see a transition of leadership. What's the transition? Somebody help me out. Moses to Joshua, okay? So why does this transition take place?
Because Moses gets old and God buries him.
Moses gets old and God buries him on, was it Mount Nebo? Okay. But the bigger underlying part of the story is Moses was prevented from what?
Seeing the promised land.
Not seeing.
Oh, no, going into it.
Entering. Because the Lord took him up on Mount Nebo so he could see the promised land, but he was prevented from entering the promised land, which is why this transition takes place, because Joshua now leads the people across the river into the promised land. Okay? So this is a really defining moment in the history of Israel. Okay? Does anybody know why Moses was not allowed to cross into the promised land?
Struck the rock.
He struck the rock instead of speaking to it, right? The Lord told him to speak to the rock and call water out, and instead he used his staff and he struck the rock, right? There is a whole lot we can learn from that, right? Moses leaned back on what he had previously seen, the miracle of this staff and all the things God did in the plagues and how he split the Red Sea and all of these things God did. And so Moses leans back on previous experience instead of trusting God in new, right? At that point, he hadn't spoken like that to call anything forward like that. He had used this physical thing. And so he falls back on his own comfort instead of stepping in faith and doing what God instructed him to do. And the fallout from that is he misses out on the blessing of the promised land. So as Christians and spiritual leaders, we can take a little bit of a learning from this that says, listen, even if we're men and women of God walking in leadership, a lack of obedience can cause us to miss a blessing. You understand? It didn't justify his position with God. God was the one who buried him. God still took care of Moses. But because of that, there was a consequence. So our disobedience, even as leaders and mature Christians, can cause a consequence. And sometimes that's missing the blessing God intended, right? Doesn't mean we've jeopardized our relationship with God. It means we missed out on God's best because we were disobedient. So there's something there for us, all right? Now, what else is taking place here in this transition of leadership is something very dynamic. Moses wasn't the only one prevented from seeing the promised land. Who else was prevented?
The old generation.
Yes, and specifically Joshua's generation, right? So Joshua and Caleb are really the only two left from that generation that cross over into the promised land. Now Joshua and Caleb were also what? They were two of the what that came back with a different report.
12 spies.
They were two of the 12 spies that were sent in to survey the promised land by Moses, right? 10 of them came back and said, this land is filled with giants. There's no way. We're like grasshoppers to them. We're never going to be able to conquer this land. Even though God had said to do it, they came back and said, no way. But only Joshua and Caleb came back and said, it's possible. Let's go. They failed to sway the vote, as you can imagine. The 10 won the day. They voted it down. The Lord was upset and said, you're now going to wander the desert for 40 years. You understand that the journey from Mount Sinai to where they were heading in the desert to the transition point here with Joshua should have only taken over a couple months to get to that point. But God led them around the desert for 40 years until that generation died off because of their unbelief. So now we have this extremely dynamic thing happening. The two leaders that are leading into this transition are Joshua and Caleb. Everybody else is a younger generation. Some may have seen some of the miracles that God did in the Exodus. Some may have been born after, right? The reality is this young generation is now coming in. The previous generation were the ones that were standing around Mount Sinai and told Moses, we'll do this. God will be our God. We'll abide by this covenant. But then they all die out in the desert. So you've got this whole new generation of people Joshua's leading into the desert, or leading across the Jordan into the promised land that may not have even been old enough to understand what was happening even if they were born at the time. Right? So you got a whole new generation that doesn't have the same experience in seeing God's hand at work and trusting God that the previous generation did, even though they had groaned and complained and were kept from entering the promised land. And that complaining spirit continued on, by the way. They complain about Moses' leadership. They complain about the food. They complain about the water. I mean, they just complain. Again, this for us becomes a teaching lesson, right? If we look at the overall, God's response to that complaining attitude is a pretty tough response. So that tells me if God reacts pretty bluntly to that complaining attitude, maybe I should watch mine. I shouldn't walk around with the complaining heart, right? I trust the Lord, and I move through life in faith. I trust what he's doing, okay? It's not always the easiest, right? Can anybody else say, sometimes you just want to sit down on the curb and complain for a minute, right? And you just want somebody to share in your misery and tell you how bad it really is so you just feel better about what you're thinking. But the reality is, we just can't stay there. And our complaining can't turn against the Lord's leadership. We got to understand that too. Because the Lord's leadership are called to lead out in faith as God's leading them. And the people didn't have the whole picture like Moses did. As Moses went into the tent of meeting and met with the Lord as a man meets face to face with their friend, like the word says, he's getting instruction for this that the rest of the group. Matter of fact, when the Lord descended and started to shake the Mount Sinai, they said, don't let God speak to us anymore. Moses, you go speak to us. And then he does, brings the word back, and they complain against him. Right? You see this creates an issue. Okay? So that's the generation that dies out in the desert. This new generation's following Joshua now across the Jordan and into the promised land. So we're going to pick this up now that we have a little bit of a background. Okay? There's certainly more we could touch right here at the beginning of Joshua, but I wanted to set that stage because there's some important things I want to bring out. So let's jump to Joshua chapter 4. now that we have a little bit of a history, Joshua chapter 4. Okay? This is a really important moment here in this scripture for multiple reasons. Okay? So we're going to pick this up. Let's go Joshua chapter 4. We're going to go verse 4 to 7. If I could have somebody read that. And then we'll have somebody else read 8 through 9. Okay? And again, if you're reading anything other than NIV, just because that's the default I go to, just let us know what your translation is. Okay?
So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulders according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever."
All right? So let's pick up 8 and 9. Somebody else.
So the Israelites did as Joshua commanded them. They took 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, as the Lord had told Joshua, and they carried them over with them to their camp, where they put them down. Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood, and they are there to this day.
Okay. So this seems like a pretty weird story to just jump into. Okay, I know you guys are totally like, wait, I thought we were in Isaiah, right? I know. I chose to take a week off and tackle something else that just sparked my heart today in study, okay? So here, I want you to see something interesting, okay? There's a correlation here, right? The Lord is revealing about Joshua's leadership, right? So here's Joshua, the young gun. Moses hands the baton off. Moses, by the Lord's power, divided what?
The Red Sea.
The Red Sea, okay? And it stood up, and they walked across on dry ground. You see any similarities here, right? The Jordan is at flood stage, okay? Which means water's coming down from the mountains, it's overflowing its banks, it's rushing, it's deeper, and here the Lord stops it up, okay? Holds it in place so that they can cross on dry ground. Okay, very similar. Holds the water back, they cross on the dry ground. Now there's a difference here in how this happens. I want you to see this. The priests are carrying what? The Ark of the Covenant, right? That wasn't around when Moses parted the Red Sea. Moses took his staff, right, and he stretched it out over the waters, and the Lord did the job. But what happens here? It's a little bit earlier in chapter 3. The priests who received the instruction and are carrying the ark are told by Joshua to go out and head into the water. And it says in chapter 3, verse 14, "So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet, as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing." Right? So this took a little more action and faith in action. Right? They're literally starting to walk into the water before it starts to pile up. Right? How many of you have ever been asked by God to do something and you literally have to step out before you see it start to happen? Right? This story always speaks to me. You know, we pray for miracles, and we often want to see the water stop first before we go start to venture into the dry ground. But in this case, the priest carrying the ark had to actually touch the water. They're going down into the water as the Lord now stops it. This, for me, is a telling piece. Their faith now is mixed with action. They're literally beginning the journey into the water before it stopped. Sometimes God calls us off the bank into the water before the flow is stopped. And sometimes our faith has to carry us there. Okay? So here, right, the Lord is revealing something about Joshua's leadership, right? Joshua, hearing from the Lord, okay, had a moment with the Lord in Joshua 1. Now, I want you to understand that when Moses handed the baton off, it wasn't just like take it and run. The Lord now met with Joshua at the beginning right, of Joshua. It says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm going to give them. So he gives the mandate again. Now he's giving it to the new leader. So God has a moment with Joshua. Joshua, in turn, prepares the people to cross the river. The Lord stops the water up like he did for Moses. He's revealing himself, moving through a new leader. The obedience of the leader leading out. Okay, now we get to the significance of this picture. What do we see happening here in the middle of this? After everybody's crossed, Joshua sends some people back. Who does he send back? Joshua 4.
He sent representatives of the 12 tribes.
Mm-hmm. So he sent one representative, right, from each tribe. So 12 people ventured back in to the dry ground, right? The ark is still there. The water's still stopped up. And what does he instruct them to do? Pick up a stone, right? Each one is to pick up a stone, right? They bring it back to the shore. They set it down, and what does Joshua do with it?
He builds like an altar almost.
Yeah, he builds a memorial. Okay? Takes the 12 stones, he builds a memorial, and what's the purpose of this memorial? Okay? To remind the children, right? And it says,
To serve as a sign among you.
there you go. So it's to serve as a sign among them, right? So anybody who sees, and so when their children ask what these stones mean, they have something to reference. Oh, this was the day, Johnny. Probably wouldn't be Johnny in Hebrew, but whatever it is. This is the day. This is the day where God stopped the river at its deepest stage, and we all came across on dry ground. Okay? So there's a valuable piece in this memorial, and the reason I'm asking this question is, the reason we're talking about this, because I want to ask the question: what are we doing as memorials for the next generation? You see, this generation was the new generation. The other one had died in the desert, remember? So they're starting off new. They see this incredible work. Whether they saw part of the Red Sea or not, how young this generation is, we don't get, but we understand this isn't the same as the complaining one that died in the desert. So this generation's fresh, new. They're seeing this new thing. God just stopped the water. They all walked across. Miracle. They all understood what the flood stage was. They wandered in the desert for 40 years. Surely they'd seen cycle after cycle of the flood, of the overflowing Jordan at this point. They understood it. So now when God does the miracle of stopping up this water so that they can pass on dry ground, it's important to Joshua to begin to establish as a leader a lineage and a heritage. You see that? Joshua directs them to set these stones up as a memorial, as a sign. What are the things we're doing in our generation, right? Hopefully we're not the complaining generation that dies out before we see the promised land, right? And that's figurative, if you get what I'm saying. I don't want to miss the blessings, right? But hopefully we're not walking with that complaining heart. But what are we doing to set up a memorial, a sign, to set up a lineage, a heritage for the next generation to be able to point to the works of the Lord, to be able to point to what God has done, to be able to celebrate like we have celebrated, and to remember. So what are some ways we can do that in our lives? That's part of this conversation. Yeah. So for those of you who are watching online, the response was keeping a journal, writing letters in journals, prayers in journals. And if anybody chose to look back in the future, they could get an idea of the faith that we had and how we called upon the Lord and what God did and spoke to us. That's a good way. All right? What else? What are some other things? It doesn't have to be physical things. What are ways that we're creating a heritage?
Pouring into other people spiritually.
Spiritually pouring into other people. Okay, great. We have a term for that, right, in the New Testament, in our church. What is it?
Discipleship.
Discipleship, right? And we have laid out a definition of what a healthy disciple looks like, right? Because we want to be taking that disciple model and reproducing in the generation after us. How do we reproduce? How do we reproduce healthy things? We pour into them, but in what ways? Words and actions.
Spending time with them and teaching and just kind of walking through life with them, showing them how it's done, I guess.
Yeah, spending time with them, walking with them, teaching, right? Go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's something different between bringing your kids to the house of the Lord to have them preached at, which we need to do. That's a piece of it. Another piece is that ability to take them close to you and talk in personal experience, right? Those are two totally different methods of conveying the wonders of God. One is very powerful in its broadcast. One is very stirring and motivational in its design. The other is very intimate and powerful in a different way, right? It gets behind facades. It falls into those quiet thought processes when you're alone. My mom went through this, or my dad went through this, and to this day I remember my mom talking about testimonies of people. One particular instance where she swore to me her whole life that it was an angel that came and visited her, that came in, gave her a word. She was working a midnight shift at a gas station. She was a young mom. She was struggling. She was really going through a tough time. And this elderly gentleman who just had this, my mom described just this glow, this feel about him, came in, called her by name. He had never met this man before, called her by name, looked her in the face. He didn't buy anything. He wasn't there to do any transaction. Gave her a very specific word for her situation, and then walked out the door. She said before she could come around the counter and get out the door, he was already gone. She couldn't find him. Like, you're talking 30 seconds. How does somebody disappear walking out the front door 30 seconds later? My mom to this day, well, she's with Jesus now, so she probably has her answer, but she swore to me her whole life that was an angel. And for me, I'm like, as a little kid hearing those stories, I just grabbed them because it wasn't a story in a book, right? I'm like, God, you do things like that? Yeah, absolutely. And that even comes into the house too, right? Bringing them to prayer time. Bringing them to Bible study. Not dictating they go, but bring them with you. I had a pastor the other day who was just talking to me, and in his private time, he just thought, Lord, somehow the Lord brought it to his mind. Do my kids see me pray? Do my kids see me study the Word? He gets up before they do. He sits in the quiet kitchen. He studies the Word, he prays, he gets up, puts his stuff away, and goes about his day. He's like, but how do they know I was even studying the Word? Do they see me studying the Word? Do I leave my door cracked to my bedroom so they can see me knelt in prayer? Pardon me. He's like, these are powerful things. It's one thing for me to tell them I do it, but it's another thing for them to be familiar with the visual, that he actually does it. So this pastor was like, I've got to start at least leaving my Bible open on the table to where I was studying, so they know Dad was here and was studying. Before he left, he gave time for the Lord, right? So these are ways that we can what? We can put those little monuments in place in our life, these signposts that our families and our heritage can be built upon. Right? You see, does that make sense? Okay? So this is important for Joshua with this young generation. It's important for us and our current generation. You know, it seems like the church, in some cases, is getting quieter and the world is getting louder. Right? But I don't think that's an indication that God's not moving, by the way. I think we just have more visuals of the world than we've ever had before. But we've got to start to produce these visuals in our life, these monuments in our life of God's power, of God's wonder, of God's working, of God's the testimony of God's purpose and plan in our lives. Because there's a generation, should the Lord tarry, that's going to come after us that may inherit a more dire situation if things don't change. And they've got to be grounded. They've got to be grounded in their faith. Because what happens with the people of Israel, we'll talk about in just a few minutes. So let's skip ahead. Let's go to Joshua chapter 23. So Joshua leads the people through conquest. Okay? He leads the people to conquer the Canaanites. The tribes of Gad and Reuben and half of the tribe of Manasseh stay on the other side of the Jordan. But in the fashion that they had discussed, they would help the other tribes conquer the land before they went to settle. So they did. They sent their troops. They went and they did what they needed to do. The land was divided up. Okay? The first one to get their allotment was Caleb. The first one to get his part of the promised land was Caleb. The other what? The other spy. The other one who trusted God the first time was the first one to get his allotment. The last one was who? Joshua. Joshua made sure everybody else had what they needed, right? Everybody gets land except for what tribe? Does anybody know? The Levites. What do they get? Cities. They're assigned to cities. Okay? They don't get actual land like the rest of the tribes. And in studying this today, I heard an explanation I'd never heard before. Right? That it was God's intention that the priest be scattered among the people to be present in the spiritual leadership of all of these places. Instead of them being brought into one place of dwelling in the land, the Lord allowed his spiritual leaders to be scattered across the country so that they could be ingrained into the society of the whole nation across each tribe's allotment of land. I was like, that's brilliant, God. Right? Okay, so they don't receive land in that, all right? But Joshua's the last one to receive his portion. And then Joshua begins here at the end of the chapter, or at the end of the book, he begins to give his farewell. So Joshua 23, I want you to see. Now, Joshua starts this off, okay, by sending his own spies in. By the way, the spies go to where? Jericho, right? And they go stay with who? Rahab. Okay, that's the beginning. Joshua sends his own spies in. They go and they stay with Rahab, which I never thought of this either. Why do you think they stayed with a prostitute? This is so plainly strategic. It just went right over my head.
Who else would you stay with? I mean, somebody who's high up in their society that you're about to destroy? Or somebody that's not been treated well by the society?
Right, yeah. So you framed that way nicer than I would. Like, if some travelers from some other city are going to stay with anybody in a city, it's going to be the town prostitute, right? If they're going to hide out, it's going to be in that place, right? I was like, why all these years did that escape me? That this was like the most logical place for them to hide and not draw attention to themselves, right? I know it's kind of humorous to talk about it now, but in a real life and death scenario where they're trying to just blend in as travelers that are housed with somebody, that seems to be the place, right? Ironically, her faith in that moment, receiving these men, asking for the protection when Joshua comes, she becomes part of what? Does anybody know? Rahab? The Hall of Fame. Yes, she does. That's not the answer I was looking for, but that's funny. Okay, in Hebrews, you're right.
Becomes one of the women in the line of Jesus.
Absolutely.
David and so on.
Correct. Her lineage now is brought into the line of Jesus, right? This is amazing, right? So, following that victory at Jericho, okay, Joshua leads them through the rest of the conquest. He leads them in faith and establishing their trust in the Lord Jesus, even with the city of Ai, right? He's so committed to the Lord's plan. There was actually this term called harem in Hebrew, okay? It was essentially the spoils of war are reserved for the Lord and his purposes. He determines what's done with them, right? So there was this understanding as they're tackling the conquest of the land, anything that they gain as the spoils of war is the Lord's. Okay, this was this idea, which is why the sin of Achan, or Achan, however you say it, becomes so serious, because he had taken a portion of this for himself when it was reserved for the Lord. So they handle that scenario. Joshua calls him out, the whole thing. You know, him and his family are dealt with. They go back, they finish the battle, and they move on with the conquest. So Joshua all along is developing this incredible heritage as a leader, a godly man that does what God asks him to do. Now here at the end, he set this example for the people. Now here at the end, he says this. Joshua chapter 23. Let's read 6 through 8. Can I have somebody read that?
Be very strong, be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them. But you are to hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have until now.
Okay. So he begins to give this instruction, right? Now remember, this is not the generation that received the covenant at Mount Sinai from Moses. They may have been present, right? But just based on the declaration, this is a new generation, that the other one died out. That previous generation was the one that heard the law given by Moses, the Levitical law that unpacked for the tabernacle, all of those kind of things. They agreed. Now this generation has to be refamiliarized with that. That's about to happen, right? This covenant is about to be re-agreed upon here. But before he gets to that, he says, be strong. What does he say? Be careful to obey, right? Obey all that's written in the book of the law, which would have been Leviticus, okay? And Deuteronomy, okay? So in this case, we see the call for them to be obedient in the covenant. The law established the way that the people of Israel communed with God. Okay? The law established how they walk in relationship with God, because God is holy. Right? So this new generation has to be reminded, these are the ways that you walk in relationship with God. So as we set this lineage and heritage for our families, we're setting that example. This is how we walk in relationship with God. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, there's an interesting thing here. He says, do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Does anybody understand this? Because God's directive was to clear the land. Was it not? Okay, there's one group, Gibeon, that dupes Joshua into thinking they're faraway visitors, but they were neighbors, and they got a treaty with them. Okay, so we didn't have to battle them to bring them in. So Gibeon still exists in the area. But when the word says that they utterly destroyed them, that no one was left alive, do you think that was a complete annihilation? What do you think? You think that's accurate, or do you think it's hyperbole?
Neither.
Okay?
I think once they destroyed their government, their seat of power, so they go against Jericho and they knock that down. It's not like nobody lived outside of Jericho.
Right.
They go to, Ashdod, and they knock out the Philistine stronghold there, but it doesn't mean that there's nobody else around.
Correct. Okay, so maybe hyperbole is a strong word, but in other Semitic, okay, that's the people of the area, the language, Aramaic, Hittite, those kind of things, and their writings about conquests, it was a popular and familiar thing where when they would talk about conquering somebody, they would use this overtly strong expression that we utterly destroyed them. Nothing was left. When in fact, it meant they literally subdued them. And by virtue of the fact that there are still people from these places that existed in Canaan, that Joshua had to tell them, be careful about these people, we can get this sense that they're using these similar literary techniques where they literally didn't destroy every breathing thing, but they were using this emphasis that we utterly dominated this. Does that make sense? And because of that, the Lord and Joshua recognize that there's still people left in this land of Canaan that they've got to be on their guard for. Why? What does it say? Because you must not serve them or bow down to them, right? What exactly takes place is what he warns against. Okay? This generation does pretty well. We'll see that in a minute. Joshua leads this generation well. But the generation to come after them does exactly what he said not to do. They literally begin that process. And that slide away from the Sinai covenant is what brings us to where we are in Isaiah. Does that make sense? Okay, now watch this. Let's read verse 12. Joshua 23, verse 12 and 13. Somebody read that for me.
But if you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them,
Yep, and 13.
then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you.
And what exactly do we see happen in 722 BC? Does anybody, the northern kingdom, 722 BC, we talked about it. Anybody know what happens?
Gets taken by Babylon?
Assyria.
Assyria, the other one.
The Assyrians in 722 BC conquer the northern kingdom and take them captive. In 587 BC, the Babylonians come in under King Nebuchadnezzar. Under King Nebuchadnezzar, or is it these? King Nebuchadnezzar comes in 587. He removes the king, takes him captive, takes a whole slew captive in exile, and he destroys Jerusalem. These words literally come true because they did what? They disobeyed. They intermarried. They brought their gods into their belief system. It became thorns in their sides. They became rebellious. They forgot the covenant that they had made, which they're about to do in verse 24. It says, chapter 24 says the covenant's renewed at Shechem. So he goes through and he reads the law of the covenant. He presents it to them, and here's their response. Okay? After doing that, in verse 14 of 24, he says, now fear the Lord and serve him with all your faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your ancestors your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. This is a leader rising up, going, this is the way. Sorry. I'm flashing too. Mandalorian, wow. Religion. Sorry. There's a, never mind. It's a phrase from a show. But anyway, this is the leader rising up saying, listen, you need to serve the Lord your God alone. But if you choose for whatever reason not to, know this. I'm serving the Lord, and so is my house. Okay? So after he says all of this stuff to them, he gives them the history of their country, history of the people again. Then he says, in second half of verse 19, if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you after he has been good to you. Second time, he warns them, right? If you don't obey, this is coming, right? Moses did the same thing in the first covenant. He said, if you're careful to obey all of the words of this law, you'll walk in the blessing. But if you don't, right? Moses did the same thing with the previous generation. And they didn't hear it. Remember? They wandered the desert 40 years. They never made it. Hear this generation. I want you to see this. Verse 24 of chapter 24. And the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and obey him. On that day, Joshua made a covenant for the people. And there at Shechem, he reaffirmed for them decrees and laws. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone, here's another one, set it up under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. Again, a memorial for this moment. That was verse 26 of chapter 24 of Joshua. Then in verse 27 he says, see, he said to all the people, this stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words the Lord has said to us. It will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God. Now, I want to show you the result of Joshua's leadership. Look at this, verse 31. Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. Okay? Following that group, the next generation goes sideways. Right? So there is deep concern here in Joshua's leadership on passing this heritage down. There's deep concern for me as a pastor. What are we going to do? How are we passing down this faith? How are we setting this heritage? How are we handing down the goodness of God and revealing God's might at work? As I'm praying for a new building, I'm praying in part that this building become that piece we can all point to. See what God did? Look at this. The stones that are set in place on this building are a testament to God's faithfulness, to his power and his provision. I'm looking for those things that we hand down to the next generation. How do we do it? Because I don't want the next generation to be the last generation. So not only do we teach them about the power and the wonder of our God, but we teach them as well how to hand this most holy faith to the next generation. We've got to create this discipleship model that continues to teach the next generation. This is vital and important. And in fact, like I told you a minute ago, this generation was the last one before things go really sideways and they fall far away from where they started at Mount Sinai and even here with Joshua. They begin to go sideways in a hurry, and then we hear the prophets come in and begin to speak to them before all the exile and all of those things begin to happen. All right? This is a powerful piece of the history of God's people. Why is this so important for us to look back? You say, hey, the Old Testament was so long ago. Why is this so important for us to learn from? Absolutely. God can still get angry, right? God, we can still disobey and face consequence, right? What else?
We learn from the past to understand our future. And I feel like it's important for us to understand the lessons, but also, at least the way I've been taught, the Old Testament is really showing how everyone needs Jesus. And that's the whole point of the Bible, is we need Jesus. And so it shows us where we miss the mark. And the New Testament, if you tie that in, how Jesus covers our sins and is able to help us meet the mark.
So what do you think the laws of the Old Testament in the covenant speak to us today? I'm not saying all of the very specifics, but the idea of the structure, what do you think it speaks to us today? If it was so important that Joshua needed to reiterate these again to this next generation, and in response to them they say, we agree, we will serve the Lord. What does the terms of that covenant mean for us today? Maybe I phrased that really weird, but
I suppose it is an example of how we must then live, of how we are meant to be in covenant with God, I suppose.
yeah, covenant is a binding relationship, right? And God invites us into this relationship, but not without, thank you, the law represents boundaries, right? There's love in boundary, right? You heard me say it a few weeks ago. Taking the cross and not having boundaries is not the gospel. You can't claim the cross and not have boundaries. The cross defines something for us. It defines the new covenant that says, if you walk in my ways, right, then I'll be in you and you'll be in me, right? We didn't have the blood covering of the one high priest like we do now back in the Old Testament. So what did they have? They had this system of ways that they would come into relationship with God and continue to walk in accordance to obedience to his way. That hasn't shifted as we've transitioned into the new covenant. There is still an expectation that we walk with God in obedience, right? So we can see that model hasn't changed. What's changed is the way we receive that relationship, the way that we receive the covering of our sin. Hebrews tells us that what the blood of sacrifices couldn't do, the blood of Christ does, in that it cleanses the conscience of the worshiper. It not just covers the sin, it not just atones for that and makes us white as snow, but it goes deep down to the inside of man so that we no longer think the way we did as we walked in sin. We no longer carry the guilt of the iniquity weighing us down of the things that we've done, but now we walk free and clear in mind, heart, so we can worship what? In what does he say to the woman at the well? In spirit and in truth. The whole person now comes into this new relationship, this new covenant of blessing in relationship with God. And we walk in accordance with his ways and his purpose, in obedience. You see how that's why the Old Testament's so important, right? It was pointing forward. So there's still some very valuable things that we see in the Old Testament.
God put this on my heart a little earlier in the message, and I've been waiting for the opportunity, so here it is. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity.
That's good. Thank you for sharing that. On that note, can we just pray tonight? I mean, we can continue to talk, I suppose, but that seems like a great way to bring us into this prayer of humility, reception, obedience. God, help us fulfill your word. Does anybody want to lead us out in prayer tonight? want to say thanks to, let's see, Kame for jumping in, Sue Webb, hi everybody, Klaus, great to see you, Tom Toya, Heather Disway, Lorraine Erickson, and Cindy and Don Ford, great to see all of you. Thanks for jumping in with us tonight. I would just pray you guys have a great rest of your week, and I can't wait to be with you on Sunday for the next the next message in our series, Stories Jesus Told. So check in with us on Sunday or come be with us in the house. Have a great rest of the week.